Welcome everybody to this panel, the next step in TV and media, Ultra HD. I'm not David Price, as indicated in that, but I'm standing in for him. I'm his colleague, and he couldn't be here. But he sent me a wonderful set of questions, which I think will obviously have very good panel participants, and so we should get some very lively discussions.
Very hard to hear you.
Okay. Yep. All right, so just to start, I just wanted to introduce, I think many people do know about the Ultra HD Forum. It was begun 4 years ago with David Price and the David Wood from EBU. And it's been gaining a lot of momentum with almost 50 members, including content providers and major content and major operators. And right now, its goal was more than just talking about spatial resolution and so on. It was actually to have a forum for advocacy and for education, to be able to actually make sure this deployment of UHD is easier. Talking about real world issues. And some guidelines, and in fact, there's a Phase A guidelines that has been made available to all the standards bodies, DVB, MPEG, SMPTE, and so on. And also, there have been good guidance for processing delivery of Ultra HD in live scenarios, okay, which is complementing other work done by BDA and so on. So, with that, I'd like to have our panelists introduce themselves.
Sure. My name is Andrew Grant. I'm responsible for the OTT and digital home business at Dolby. We've been doing quite a bit of work in the HDR space. We've been rolling out Dolby Vision, which is our solution for high dynamic range capture, creation, distribution, and playback.
Hi, Chris Wagner, co-founder of New Lion. New Lion is a video distribution company. We work with a lot of sports leagues, clubs, sports networks. We did about 63,000 live sports events last year, delivered over the internet, and we've just finished 4 big 4K events, El Clasico out of Barcelona. Last month we've done 2 events with BT Sports, NBA games, and we did a 4K broadcast with Univision over the top out of Marlins Stadium a couple months back. So we've always been focused on video quality. We think 4K is and HDR are 2 big things to really change the experience on the internet.
Nick Colsey, business development for Sony Electronics, and amongst other things, I manage the apps that we distribute on our smart TVs. And also closely involved in our 4K initiatives, including bringing 4K content, both on demand and live, to Sony 4K TVs, including high dynamic range, which I think we're going to talk about on the panel today.
John Patty, I just started AMC Networks. I came from Time Warner Cable, was there for 10 years. Worked on their Time Warner TV app, the OTT app, and then been doing a lot of advanced research on 4K, HDR, 1080p. Like that.
Okay, thank you. So let me start with this first question. 4K has not experienced its big breakthrough yet. Do you think people now got wind that there's more to UHD than mere pixels and are holding back until they see the results of HDR with the white color gamut? Start with you.
I can go first if you want.
Sure.
So when I was at Time Warner, there's a lot of discussions about why 4K wasn't taking off. And from my perspective, what I was seeing is the content providers weren't making it available to us why they expect. And I think there's a couple reasons. The biggest one is production costs. I mean, a Hollywood film is shot in 4 or 8K, but all the post is done in 2K. So no one's really doing the adoption to get it to you. And I think live sports is the biggest thing right now, and there doesn't even seem to be a lot of, like we were saying, how many live sporting events in the United States are scheduled to be broadcast in 4K this year? I think it's 0.
I have an answer to that.
Well, I'm saying, but it's, I mean, I'm broadcast TV on cable, right? It's really, really small. And I think that's why the adoption rate isn't what people expect. And that's what I was seeing and what Now being at AMC, it's the same thing. We're not even talking about 4K. They want to do HDR and do other things, but 4K really isn't the primary focus right now for what we're doing.
I think it depends how you measure adoption. Certainly if you look at the number of TVs that are in US homes, adoption is much faster than HD was. There'll be around 20 million TVs, 4K TVs in US homes by the end of this year, and another almost 20 million in 2017. So, it's really growing very, very fast in terms of screens in homes. But yeah, as John said, content still isn't where we'd all like it to be. Sony was one of the first because we own a studio. We were able to ensure that most of the new movies that we make were either shot in 4K or scanned from film to 4K, so that we build up what we think is the largest library in Hollywood of 4K content. And we make that available through our own services, such as Sony Pictures Ultra, streaming in 4K and with HDR in some cases, and of course via others such as Netflix, Amazon. Movies and a lot of TV shows like The Blacklist. That's all shot in 4K. Those are available, but still, I think sports is the area we're really focusing on this year, working with New Line to get those live 4K sports events directly to Sony TVs. And I think Chris is going to talk a bit more about that.
Yeah, on the content side, 4K is not going to go through the traditional cable set-top box. It's just that QAM system's not going to handle it. It's all going to be delivered IP. It's all going to be delivered over the top. So if you're a cable company, broadband's your most profitable product, right? And our average bit rates for a 720p stream average about 4 to 5 megabits. The 4K live streaming events that we've done so far average between 18 and 20. So cable companies love it because of the amount of broadband that it consumes. There are also companies launching specific 4K channels with a hybrid set-top box that includes an IP box. Rogers announced a 4K channel up in Canada. BT Sports in London has a dedicated 4K channel, multiple 4K channels. The 4K trucks that are out there now from NAP and others that produce 4K can also produce a 1080p or a 1080i signal to go through the traditional broadcast. So it's coming. We'll do this year about 10 in 2016 live 4K events. Univision has plans for a number of 4K events. They own the rights to League MX here in the US, and they do a bunch of CONCACAF things. One of the big things you'll see in June is the Copa America Centenario, which is the competition between North and South America in soccer. And that final game at MetLife Stadium will be a 4K live event. UFC, who's a customer of ours, has plans for a number of 4K events. World Surf League, who's a customer of ours, has plans for a number of 4K events. So 4K sports, if you haven't seen it, we're talking 60 frames, 4 times the resolution of 1080. It's very noticeable. I mean, it's an experience that puts you inside the arena or on the surfboard, as we were talking about. I think it's a real game changer around the experience side. It's definitely not going through the cable set-top box, which is the problem in the U.S. with the MVPDs and the boxes that many of you have. But Roku has a 4K box. Many of the 4K TV sets support 4K 60-frame streams. So there's, it's out there. It's all going to be delivered, by IP, though.
We sort of come at Dolby to this problem from a slightly different direction, as we do occasionally. Sort of looking at, as my friend Pat Griffiths likes to say, there are more pixels, higher resolution, faster pixels, and then there's the concept of better pixels, right? And so if the intention is to go and capture and distribute an event or color grade a movie and then display that back at the highest perceptual quality, you can go and start to toggle with those 3 different levers in order to be able to deliver the best experience possible given the device that you're actually hitting and the constraints of the delivery path that you're using to get there. So our perception or our sort of point of view is that 4K is, where the distribution mechanism is capable, and the device itself, the 4K screen, is capable of rendering 4K. Obviously, that's if you can deliver the higher resolution, it's great to deliver the higher resolution. I think your colleague, Matthew Goldman, if he was sitting at this table, he would say that distance matters, right? So that the proximity to the screen relative to the screen size is really what either does or doesn't allow you to get the most out of a 4K signal. And most people in their living room sitting 10 feet away from a screen that's 50 inches or 75 inches, they're not really going to see the benefit of 4K as deeply as they might if they were holding an iPad in front of their eyes. However, when you get into the idea of working in high dynamic range, the benefit is obvious, independent of the resolution. And so what we've seen, both talking to sports leagues and also engaging, now we've got, I think 40 titles are out from Warner Brothers on Vudu for streaming 4K UHD, so 4K high dynamic range Dolby Vision content. We found that the perceptual change is dramatic when you start to work with color gamut a little bit differently than just pushing more bits in higher resolution. So I think that the big piece there is that, I think your point, Chris, is absolutely right. It's not per se the cable guys who are sort of encumbered by legacy set-top boxes and a footprint both of infrastructure and playback devices that don't necessarily render these experiences appropriately. It's going to be the guys who are driving the boat, the Netflix, Amazon, Vudu, and then the live sports events that are being pushed over the top that I think are really going to introduce, they're going to fundamentally change consumer expectations over the course of the next year. And there's a lot of content in that pipeline, probably more so than there is just 4K content.
Yeah, agreed.
So actually, a couple of questions that follows on some of what Chris and you touched on, and in particular, what you just said is, do you see capabilities of doing HDR to SDR and vice versa, and the other thing is conversion residing in the chain? Will it sit in the TV? If so, how will metadata be used to ensure content is correctly displayed? And also how will live streams be handled differently to stored content? Will SDR ads coexist with HDR content?
Yeah, I mean, those are all, absolutely. If you could do them in David's accent, that would be great. Those are very David Price questions. So, we look at this and say, Dolby Vision is fundamentally a base layer and then a metadata layer that sits on top. And that metadata is designed to basically provide the appropriate scene level instruction set to the playback device, the rendering screen, to be able to go and map essentially the signal to the playout characteristics of the screen itself. And again, that's done in the grading level on a scene-by-scene basis, so it's dynamic metadata. It sounds like some of the questions there are, to what extent does that signal, when delivered to a standard dynamic range screen, improve the quality for someone who's dealing with a standard dynamic range device or playback screen, television, tablet, or otherwise. It's not, in the movie use case, right, you're actually going through a process of color grading, that you're color grading on a, say it's on a 10,000 nit screen, right, which is not what you have in front of you in your living room. You're actually able to work as a colorist in a much more granular scale than you would be if you were trying to go and grade something on a 1,000 nit screen, or which is what you do with HDR10, or if you were working with the standard sort of Rec 709 color space. And what that means is that the actual asset itself would be of improved quality, but that's not the relationship between the HDR signal and the screen itself. Those are two different elements. What we found is, like, when you deal with user interface, which is oftentimes has elements that are in standard dynamic range, or you're dealing with ads that are in standard dynamic range, the playout block that we've put together allows for all of those assets to be essentially processed by the television without any sort of perceptual disruption to the user. And that's a big part of sort of what we've been trying to do with the blocks that we've deployed with LG and Vizio and TCL and Skyworth and others, is ensuring that that TV is able to go and manage those disparate signals in the most appropriate way.
I don't know, I can address the live streaming side. So we think HEVC MPEG-Dash is two key standards for the delivery of the content from the content side. So we've embrace both of those at the encode transcode level, so that when you deliver the stream, you can deliver it in a number of different profiles, all the way up to 4K 60, but all the way down to maybe 720 at 4 megabits, right? So it basically takes into account the ISP that the consumer would have. But the handshake on the other side, working with Sony, is our streaming SDK. So to preserve the quality of the content being streamed over the top, Sony has implemented our streaming SDK at a lower level in their set that actually handshakes with the live streamed content. So we're really not talking about files here, right? Like you'd have with Netflix or Amazon. We're talking about a live stream, and you have to maintain that quality. It has to be delivered 4K 60. We have an HDR roadmap that's also part of that SDK, but we see the combination of the content owner streaming over the top and the CE device, Sony, shaking hands so that an internet experience really delivers what you expect from a Ultra HD standpoint.
Yeah, and to add on to that, as far as HDR is concerned in a live environment, we've been working closely with the standards organizations around hybrid low gamma, which is a standard that allows, in effect, backwards compatibility of a high dynamic range live event that's being broadcast, but it can also be received by standard dynamic range capable 4K devices. And this, of course, is very important for cable and satellite operators. They don't have to deliver an HDR and an SDR version of the same title and fill up their spectrum that way. This is standardized and is part of the guidelines in the UHD forum, we've already done successful live trials of sporting events. Obviously, it's still early days with this, but the TVs are close to being deployed with this capability as soon as the standard is fixed within the ITU, and the end-to-end production workflow is also there. Sony's in the fortunate position of having the cameras, having a lot of the production equipment, filling the 4K trucks with equipment, and having the TV sets, and of course relationships with the major sports franchise holders and distribution companies. So we think this is actually coming pretty close. So there's a lot of discussion about different standards, and clearly there's going to be different approaches depending on whether high dynamic range content is being delivered on demand or live, but we think there are good solutions for both.
I had a little different take on the metadata thing coming from the production, post-production side. So initially when we looked at the HDR, it was single stream or dual stream. So I think initially everybody said, hey, we want to do dual stream in the broadcast. And you figure, well, that won't work because we were saying you're constrained to a set-top box. So you have to have two assets, an SDR and an HDR, right? So you couldn't really manage that. So what we're finding is when you go OTT, you can actually do a dual stream, and when you're doing broadcast, you actually have to do single stream, and you have to basically have two carriages, one SDR, one HDR. But nice with the OTT deliveries, since it's a VOD asset, or you can emulate VOD delivery, that you can actually do your handshake with your device. And if it's an SDR device, they get the base layer. If it's an HDR device, they combine it, and then you get the full HDR experience. So that was one of the things I think that as an industry, everybody thought it kind of flipped. It was going to be, dual stream for broadcast and then single stream for OTT, and it kind of flipped around. The OTT is adopting dual stream, and broadcast is like, it's either HDR or it's SDR. We're not going to deal with the metadata or any of the conversion because, like I said, set-top boxes and televisions, you want to get it managing all that on the customer side. So that was just my input.
Yeah, actually picking up a little bit on that. So the next question is, there's been a lot of talk about backward compatibility, especially in the area of the new optical transfer functions, EOTF, used for HDR content. Do you have any opinions on the rivalry between HLG, initiated by the BBC, with NHK, now embodied in an Arab standard, and PQ led by Dolby and now embodied in the SMPTE 2084. What limitations are there in backward compatibility of each method? Is there any hope for the tens of millions of people who have bought 4K sets already?
I can start real quick. So that was a big discussion we had. It was kind of funny. Is all my friends come here, when should I buy a TV? I'm like, well, 2020. Like, I've needed TV for 3 years and I refused to buy one just because of what you're talking about. In my mind, you know, all the research we did, and we did a lot of research with Ericsson and Motorola as far as their PhDs that come in, and we look at color and everything. So I mean, everybody wants to get to Rec 2020, right? Today, I think Dolby Vision is barely delivering P3, is what you get in a cinema, right? So in my mind, being, I'll use the word a geek, I'm like, well, I want 2020, right? So I'm not gonna buy a TV until they can support 2020. And in me thinking, well, if I'm spending money as a consumer, I feel sorry for the people who bought 4K TVs. I mean, that's just my personal opinion. I'm not bashing anybody, but I say that you have a TV buys 2 years old, you can't watch HDR. You know, what's your HEV support? There's a lot of limitations you have. So I mean, to me, the standards in flux right now is kind of, it's a, consumers aren't jumping on 4K, right? They're buying the TVs because that's what you go to Best Buy and tell me what a 1080p TV, it's like over in the corner for $250. They're pushing the 4K TV, which is great. There's nothing wrong with that. But I think what's happening is the adoption is because that's all they're selling. And the consumers aren't, you know, jumping up and down and screaming and yelling and saying, hey, this is what we want or this is what we need. But I think the standards, you know, like we saw with Blu-ray, right? And HD DVD, right? It's going to figure itself out. And I think that's where we're at today with the TVs and what's going on. Me personally, I love, like I said, I'd love to have Rec 2020. And to me, in my personal opinion, you know, Dolby Vision, but there's other ways to attack Dolby Vision with VS10 so everybody can get their, you know, formatting in there. But that's my view, is the consumer should get the best experience. And I think we're kind of that incremental step now. Probably the end of this year, if you buy a 4K TV, you'll be in pretty good shape. I mean, you'll have just about everything you need for HDR and all that. But previously, I think they said that backwards compatibility is a huge issue because you tell somebody you're delivering HDR and they can't get it on their Joel TV, that's going to be an issue.
Yeah, needless to say, as a TV manufacturer, we have a slightly different view on that. So all
for $800, who would wait, right?
Exactly, who would wait? So you know, you can buy a 4K TV from Sony for $800.
You got three
today.
of them in the back right now, ready to go. Yeah.
Yeah, man, life's too short. I don't want to wait for 2020.
Exactly, yeah. A lot of things could happen between now and then.
That's true.
And we have high dynamic range capable sets using what is variously called 2084 or PQ. Again, from around $1,000 upwards. The vast majority of sets we sold last year are HDR compatible. We have a ton of content already being delivered using PQ 2084, whatever you want to call it, from Netflix and Amazon. And as I said, we've done live trials as well. So there's live content coming. So you know, this is not something that you need to wait a long time for. You know, the TV you bought last year is already ready for this. And then as for some of the emerging standards we've talked about, like hybrid log gamma, these things are relatively simple to update on the TV as a firmware update. So as soon as all of the standards and agreements are in place, we'll make more announcements about, and of course, as soon as there's some content to stream with hybrid log gamma, we'll talk more about that.
Yeah, I think consumers at $800 and higher don't want to tell their friends they went into Best Buy and didn't get a 4K TV. It's like, you know, I bought standard definition because I got a good price. I mean,
yeah, or
I have friends. I have friends that have 4K.
On the wall.
Yeah, exactly. 4K is cool, right? Who wouldn't want to be not cool?
I think you know, one of the questions, right? Like, can I please be not cooler, not or cool? You know, there's a couple different elements to that question, right? One of them is you know, the idea of backwards compatibility in the signal, right? So you've got the idea of a base layer and an enhancement layer, and just getting rid of the enhancement layer and discarding that, as depending on what the playout characteristics of the endpoint device happen to be. You know, and that's the profile that Voodoo is using today, which is to say, I'm going to go and deliver, you know, Dolby Vision, and in the event that I'm hitting a 4K screen that's not able to process Dolby Vision, I can still use the same stream. The OTT use case, I think, is those paradigms are not necessarily as applicable in our domain as they are in the broadcast domain, right? Because you have an idea of what is that addressable device. It's attesting to what it is, what its capabilities are. You might be able to do an EDID query to figure out what's connected downstream over HDMI. You know what you're pushing, and you're able to go and create the appropriate profile. Ideally, one single HDR profile that's able to address all HDR-enabled devices and potentially also 4K devices. And so that was sort of the use case that we tried to solve for, to be able to get to a place where you had a backwards compatible stream. That idea of, how do you go and save someone from the mistakes they made yesterday? You build a time machine, or you let them go and deal with the fact that it's now time to sort of upgrade, right? Because something that is perceptually, like discernibly different is going to be in the market very soon, or is in the market. And you can do that at price points that are really at the $800 level, right? Like we're with Vizio on the, obviously the R series, which is like an incredibly expensive aficionados television, the reference series. But the P series and, and soon to be the M series that are in market are lower cost 50-inch Vizio screens that are running Cast OS. They're really incredible screens. And they may not have the same peak luminance as the R series, but in point of fact, one of the things you can do with HDR is you can ensure that 4K or even a 2K screen that's operating in basically has lower brightness, is able to go and process these signals and get a much better experience for the user. And so I don't think necessarily the idea of solving for yesterday's TV purchases is the one that, as a forward-leaning company, that's not per se the way that we're trying to go and solve this. But the other piece is that there are oftentimes intermediate devices that have certain capabilities, like your Roku, like your Apple TV, like your Amazon Fire TV, that might be able to go and augment the capabilities of a downstream device with some of the processing capability that would otherwise be required at the IC level on that television. That's not a path that we've taken yet, but it's one that logically you can sort of see technology that says, if I have an existing 4K screen and I've got OTT set-top box X that can do some of the processing the screen can't, I would be able to go and essentially up-level the experience on that screen because I know what its basic visual playout characteristics happen to be, and I can respond to that with the appropriate metadata.
Yeah, so following up on that, do you see instances that see HDR10 being delivered in a 1080p resolution for those areas where smaller TVs are predominant, or where bandwidth restrictions will limit capabilities for full 4K UHD with HDR?
I mean, I can't speak to HDR10, right? But I'm sure it's going to be great. But I can speak to Dolby Vision, and one of the things that we were doing was we were working with one partner and sort of mapping out what are the appropriate encoding profiles to work with in order to be able to deliver the best experience. And what we did find is that downscaling resolution at around 9 megabits per second from 4 to 2K, but holding vision all the way down to around ballpark around 3 megabits per second, you get a dramatically enhanced experience without introducing artifacts or anything else, independent of the resolution of the stream. So I think that it is absolutely likely that for particularly mobile devices that are not per se 4K screens, but are definitely better than standard dynamic range in at least quantitatively, that those would be devices you would target with an enhanced SDR signal and do so in a way that really dramatically improves the experience. Yeah.
I mean, that's a big part of our streams, right? For all of our content rights holders, is to be able to deliver 6 to 8 profiles in a live stream that range from a 720 stream up to a 4K stream. A lot of the broadcasters are considering the jump from 1080i right to 4K instead of trying to outfit for 1080p. But take the World Cup a couple of years ago. We had in that 20-day tournament 74 million live video streams. That was a unique audience of 10 million people. Univision had the rights in the United States just to the Spanish feed. ESPN had the English feed. So that audience of 10 million that consumed 74 million streams, 87% of the traffic was mobile. Mm-hmm. So as they move to higher levels of quality with us on mobile and tablet, because that's where their audience is, they also want to be able to accommodate the higher end that may have a 4K set. So that profile range is important to to cover their entire audience.
So a couple more. MGO is streaming Ultra HD 4K with HDR and says that its downloads are about 60 gigabyte. Given that data caps will be exceeded at 5 or more of these a month, do you see this driving a move to HEVC, or will this be seen as a revenue generator by the broadband providers?
Let me consult my crystal ball to say what the future looks like. I think that one of the things that these enhanced content offerings, and we work obviously very deeply and closely with our studio partners on creating Dolby Vision assets for global distribution. I'm spending a lot of time in China now, sort of thinking about this, where high degrees of bandwidth variability are the norm. There is a significant opportunity to take a premium product and figure out what are the ways in which you go and have your business model respond to the fact that you're offering a premium product. And you can do that in any number of different ways. So I think that the big piece is that from a service provider's perspective, or from a studio or content creator's perspective, that there is a certain level of flexibility that this premium tier might offer that you would allow for you to basically optimize your business to whatever the constraint happens to be.
Yeah.
I mean, I think that that's just sort of basic logic, right? Yeah.
So anybody else has any opinions on
Well,
that?
I think you're starting to see now cable companies, MVPDs, increasing the data caps in response to customers' desire to stream or download these higher resolution, including 4K video content. So that's a market response. I mean, it's still being driven by customer behavior, and any sensible business is going to respond appropriately to that. It wouldn't make sense for caps to max out after watching 2 or 3 4K movies. There's already 200-300 different 4K movies available on the various different services out there. So, and those homes that have 4K TVs, I think in most cases MVPDs would find that they are probably their highest ARPU homes. So, it's going to be delivered. It's going to be driven, and the trend is going to be coming out of consumer demand.
Yeah, and you also have the video compression standard changes, right? From H.264 to H.265, and that's the HEVC compression. That's going to be more efficient over broadband. But MPEG-Dash versus HLS, MPEG-Dash we see as a way to drive live streams that have high concurrency, big tentpole events, just more efficient. Mm-hmm. So you have those things going on too, in terms of how to embrace the quality on the other side.
And then the last question here is that, do you think the move to certify content and screens with the Ultra HD Premium logo will help accelerate content availability?
That's like a political question.
It is very political.
This is your
Have the
panel.
TV
I
guy
can really say no to this.
Yeah. Well, David, I think the UHD logo is beautiful. What does it mean again? No, I think that fundamentally what you want is a consumer to understand what it is that you're offering, right? And some of the challenges that Ultraviolet faced, when that was rolled out, was the complexity of the actual use case and the product itself relative to the way that it's positioned to the end user, right? Like the consumer wants something that's simple, that's well understood, and that they know is going to signify some compelling value for the price that they're paying for the product. Right. So working for Dolby, right? We fundamentally believe that if you're able to go and brand something in such a way that it demonstrates consistency of quality for the consumer, mm-hmm. that's a really good brand, right? And we're part of the UHD Alliance as well, and we really believe that for Blu-ray 2.0 or for Ultra HD content with Dolby Vision, that consistency of the presentation across devices, particularly as the mobile and tablet devices start to roll out and OTT set-top boxes start to roll out supporting all these new functions, making sure that you consistently message that to the consumers is absolutely critical. And you can go and see the graveyard of other efforts that didn't do that early enough, and as such just created confusion as opposed to really demonstrated consistently the value that they offer consumers.
Yeah, I think as far as TVs are concerned, the ultimate decision-making point is when you're standing there in Best Buy or another retailer and comparing the picture quality of different TV sets. And at that point, logos and industry associations matter less than the subjective picture quality that you see in front of you. And certainly as far as Sony is concerned, that's how we want our products to be judged. Seeing is believing. Look at our products side by side with the competitors, and that's how you should decide.
Yeah, so to me, it's political. It's looking for the consumer side. If it's not confusing, like I said, that's great. But I think a lot of these certifications confuse people. I mean, look at THX, right?
Yeah.
Different certifications confuse people. So anything you can do to make it simpler is better. So certified could be good, but it could be bad. So that's the CPE people getting the story out and making sure people understand it. And I think if people understand it, then it'll be a really good thing.
There's also another aspect to that, right? Which is that if you have a logo for a certification authority and that certification is loose, I can see multiple different UHD Alliance endorsed televisions stacked side by side in a Best Buy, and having them be like fundamentally different from a perceptual standpoint because the standard itself doesn't actually reach all the way back to higher levels of specificity around how the content is created per se, right? So that you have variability. And you're always going to have that to an extent with TV manufacturers, right? Because they're running their own processing on top of what they've got natively deployed on the device. But I think you have to narrow. I mean, our perception is that you narrow the range of variability so that the brand means something consistently. And I can't say that I have the domain expertise to say whether UHD does that or not, but I know that that's a proposition that matters to consumers. Otherwise, it's worthless.
Thanks. So are there any questions from the audience? So we have about, 8 minutes or so. Yeah.
I have a question maybe all of you can answer in terms of the perception of Ultra HD with respect to, and I think Chris could probably answer that with respect to what's the toughest thing? Is it motion artifacts? Is it still? Is it height?
Yeah.
Is it difficult? But I mean, it cuts across everything from the acquisition side to the set side.
It does.
To HDR. So
Yeah.
what's the hardest thing, and then what really matters to the customer?
Hockey is harder than baseball. Definitely. No, that's a very good question. And we spent a lot of time on our encoding settings to deal with fast, moving, bright white, like a sheet of ice, is more difficult to clean it up and deliver it because you don't have the time on post-processing like you would with a movie or a file, right? You have the luxury of really getting it right before you publish it. With live sports, you really don't have time. Can you imagine if you missed the last 2 minutes of the Kentucky Derby? That was the entire race.
The whole race, yeah.
So,
nice hat.
Yeah. It's more of a challenge with live, both from signal acquisition. Even in the truck, how the switcher delivers that signal into our encoder and then out, right? The backhauling, all the transcoding into the ABR rates. So it's a lot more difficult than moving files around. And it's a good question. And we've done the tests that we've done. I would say of the 4 tests we've done in the last 6 months, the improvement, and Nick can answer some of that because we've been involved with Sony on all 4 of them, but the Barcelona El Clasico game, Media Pro did the 4K production, handed off to our encoder and then out of Barcelona in the arena there for FC Barcelona. That was the best one. So it's just practice and testing and the continuing work around our encoding settings to really deal with that fast-moving action. But the basketball ones we did were different than the soccer ones or different than the hockey ones. So, it's a wide range of sports that we have that we benefit from. I don't know if that answers your question, but it's not easy.
I was going to say one other thing that we found was real important. We did a lot of testing with Time Warner Sports when I was there. It was frame rate.
Yeah.
So we did a lot of testing between 30, 60, and 120. And going from 60 to 120 is pretty mind-blowing just when
That's
for
exactly
the
right.
experience. So there's a lot on the encoding side, but frame rate is huge
Very
as far
big.
as with the UHD.
And 30 to
experience.
60 is a big jump.
Yeah,
as well.
30 to 60,
Gotta be
but
60,
60
yeah.
to 120 is, I mean, it's
Yeah.
amazing. And that's why people are pushing 60, because from 30 to 60 is a big deal also. But bandwidth and all that and the live capabilities, 60 frames is very difficult to process and make
Yeah.
it look good.
Any other questions?
So Chris, you mentioned you're building streaming SDK with Sony that is not live-based, if I hear it correctly. So this is going away from standards like Dash and Chillets?
Well, no, the SDK supports MPEG Dash, and it's a streaming SDK because it supports our player, and there's a number of interactive components to the player itself. So instant replay, slow motion, are two key things that sport fans like, especially in 4K. I can remember we did the Univision game out of Madrid, or out of Miami. There was a break between the two halves, and the sprinkler came on, and the cameraman was smart enough to zoom in on the sprinkler.
Yeah, so good. Yeah.
And it was so cool, man, just watching this sprinkler in 4K. It was like mesmerizing. And slowing it down and speeding it. I mean, so the SDK and the features of that SDK are really designed to support a live stream. I don't know if you want to add anything to that.
No, that's right. Optimized around live sports delivery. There are, within the framework of the standards, there are things that you need to do to to optimize the way the stream reaches the player and gets decoded.
I don't think there's a lot of appetite to move away from the standard frameworks, right? I think that if you're going to go in that direction, you're going to run afoul of a lot of complication and complexity associated with actually hitting the, you want to amortize your infrastructure across the maximum number of sessions. And if you're doing that using something that's funky and proprietary, when DAS and HLS are pretty widely, particularly for things like late binding, they're pretty widely deployed, you don't want to go and muck around with that.
It's just in the light of this morning's keynote of the need to go to VR, going to 4K and 16, and going to crazy bit phase like 20 megs and above.
Mm-hmm.
You never know if standard will be standard delivery of HTTP or regular internet will do it eventually, or maybe you'll have to go into things like Multicast or UDP or
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
different ways of delivering.
I think that Akamai's done some really interesting things to prove out some of the work around multicast over UDP. I think that,
Yeah.
particularly for large-scale live events, there's going to be some interesting elements there. I know that they're trying to replicate some of the, essentially using HTTP-based infrastructure, but actually implementing it via multicast over UDP. It gets, very much over my brain level very quickly when you start to configure that. But I agree with you that public internet isn't per se going to scale to the point where you're able to go and do, an 8K VR feed where you're actually doing full interactive. That's a very bit-heavy proposition. I have a lot of faith, though, that it's the large-scale operators and the content providers and working with the right delivery platform partners that those problems do get solved incrementally when the market requires them to be solved.
That's right.
And I think that I have a lot of faith that that's going to happen because that's what we've seen over the market in the last 15 or 20 years.
A quick comment and then a question. I'm with Consumer Reports, and one of the issues that we're struggling with when you're talking about the ultra premium standard, is one of the things that we were hoping would be easy for customers this year to be able to buy a UHD TV with HDR and have some level of confidence for performance. So what we're seeing in our labs right now are a lot of TVs that are HDR capable. All it means is that they can read the metadata and they'll do the best they can trying to map whatever the HDR capability is to that TV's hardware. And in some instances, the hardware is really not capable of doing anything that does it justice. So just a quick comment saying that I think this year we're going to see a lot of TVs claiming HDR capability that's not going to deliver the true experience to people that's going to make them excited about it. And anything that you guys can do to help make that a little clearer to consumers that there are these different levels of performance based on a TV's brightness, color mapping, and things like that. The other question was related to Dolby Vision, and it seemed like one of the advantages was the scene-by-scene metadata will allow a TV that doesn't have those high specs to better map HDR to that TV's capability. And if I'm correct, my question is this unique to Dolby Vision? I've heard that HDR10 has something on their roadmap, but I've also heard that they can't actually do scene-by-scene metadata mapping. So
Yeah, I
I
mean,
know no one from HDR10 is here, but
it's always an interesting thing when people say they with HDR10. It's always funky for me to figure out who is the they in that proposition. I know who the they is with the Dolby thing, so I can solve that one. So I do think that you're absolutely right? That there's a high degree of variability, and there's going to increasingly be variability in the consumer experience with HDR10 because it's a very open proposition. And generally speaking, if you're moving to a TV that has lower peak luminance than the 1,000 nits at which that asset was graded, you're going to have an even higher degree of variability in the quality of that experience, right? So, as we've gone through this process of building Vision, it's been, in part oriented around not the $8,000 screens, but the $800 screens, right? And making sure that if you have a 600 nit peak brightness or peak brightness screen, that you are going to get the best that screen is capable of delivering to you as a consumer. And that's all driven by the metadata and the way in which that display mapping is actually happening with the VS10 block that's implemented on the screens, and then whatever the hardware of the actual screen itself happens to be. So I think that to the former sort of statement that you've made, that is, to no small extent, the design paradigm that we're trying to work within to be able to go and solve or at least alleviate that concern for consumers. With HDR, it may be something that there is some confusion based on the quality of the output. That's why we have Dolby Vision, right? We have a specific thing that we know is going to work best because we're testing it within those constraints.
I was going to say, too, the VS10 is very important to look at, too, because if you look at the scale, you have Dolby Vision, right? Then you have HDR10 and then SDR. So if you're VS10 support, no matter what you're getting, you're actually mapping properly. If you only support HDR10, and that's probably what you're seeing, that's when you're actually running into issues with the mapping on the TV. So a lot of the manufacturers are implementing VS10. I can't say all of them are, but that's kind of more important. And that way, Samsung's off doing their own thing, LG, Vizio. I can't speak to what Sony's doing, but I know they're all kind of doing their different things on their HDR development. But if you kind of look at a TV that has VS10, no matter what format you put into it, it's going to hopefully do the best job it can mapping it. If it only supports HDR10 and you give it the higher stream, it's not going to know what to do with it. So that's kind of the issue too. And I think that's a good thing that Dolby's done, is making that available to people. If you don't want to do Dolby Vision, at least stay within the VS10 spec, and then you can kind of do whatever you want. If you do HDR10, you're constrained, because you said there's one stream for everything. Dolby Vision is metadata per scene, so you're going to get a much better experience.
I did not cough him any bucks for that. That's beautiful.
It was just from our testing, so I spent a lot of time doing it.
Nice to know.
Thank you, guys. We're out of time now, and so I'd like to thank Andrew, Chris, Nick, and John for this panel, and also all of you for attending. So thank you very much.